Hello, my name is Paul Whittaker and welcome to the Great Merton Mysteries. In today's talk I'll be exploring some of the big questions about the life of Sir Merton Russell-Cotes and putting forward a few theories about the possible answers. I've done a lot of research in this area in recent years, but today's talk will demonstrate that I'm still a long way short of having the complete picture. And for a man who wrote a voluminous autobiography, it's amazing how many key pieces of the puzzle are still missing. But wouldn't it be boring if we knew everything? And so, among other things today, I'll be looking into his education, how he raised the money to buy and extend the Bath Hotel, and whether politics played any part in his knighthood. But I'm going to begin with a problem I've spent many fruitless hours over the years trying to resolve, and that is, where do the names Merton and Russell come from? Merton offers an explanation for both names in his autobiography, but I have to say that I'm not entirely convinced about what he's telling us. He was christened Merton, he says, after Merton College, Oxford, due to some unspecified family connection, and he tells us that the name Russell came from another side of the family. He's no more specific than that, unfortunately, and he doesn't say which sides of the family he's talking about. And to confuse things further, in another part of his autobiography, he says that his middle name came from the eminent statesman Lord John Russell, but yet again he doesn't explain why that was the case. At this point it's worth having a look at Merton's baptism record. His birth predates the start of civil registration in England, so we have to rely on parish records rather than a birth certificate. And this is the relevant page from the Register of St Peter's Church in Wolverhampton. The first name looks a lot like Morton to me, or perhaps even Martin at a stretch, but in either case it's probably a simple mistake by the person who wrote the entry in the register. But even in the unlikely event that he was originally called Morton or Martin, it doesn't really help us much, because I can't find either of those names in his family tree. In any case, he's shown as Merton on the 1841 census and all the official records after that, so I'm as confident as I can be that his parents intended to give him that name. But note the spelling of the surname. All of Merton's siblings were baptised with the A in the name, and his father and mother both signed their names like that. The family ironmongery business also appeared in trade directories with that same spelling. Merton dropped the A in his surname when he was in his early 20s, which may have been to emphasise a dubious connection to the Cotes family of Shropshire. Merton mentions his links to this family in his autobiography, but is typically vague about the exact nature of the relationship. The Shropshire Coteses were proper gentry with a lineage stretching back to Norman times. Their family history is relatively easy to follow, and I've done my best to trace all their descendants from the early 17th century right through to the time of Merton's grandparents. I can't find even the slightest hint of a link between the two families, so Merton was probably indulging in some very wishful thinking. Besides, the Shropshire Coteses didn't have any links to Merton College. Their sons went to Christ Church or Magdalen if they went to Oxford at all. So perhaps the name Merton was passed down from somewhere else in the family, but if it was, I don't know where it came from. Given that his parents and grandparents were ironmongers, tailors, metalworkers and the like, it seems unlikely that anyone within his immediate family would have gone to Oxford University. But I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that it might just be possible that he acquired his middle name from Lord John Russell. That gentleman was one of the main architects of the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave middling men like Merton's father the right to vote. There had been huge rallies in Wolverhampton in support of electoral reform in the early 1830s, and it's possible that Merton's father could have attended one of them, and even if he didn't, he had every reason to support the reformist cause. It's also interesting to note that Lord John Russell lost his parliamentary seat in the same week that Merton was born. I won't go into the politics of the situation here, but the result caused shockwaves throughout the country. Russell returned to Parliament via an uncontested seat less than a fortnight later, but the newspapers were full of the story throughout that month. If Merton's father was a keen reformist, and why wouldn't he be, then why not name your son after the movement's parliamentary hero? But if the Russell story raises a minor question about Merton's father, Then my next big mystery concerns his mother. Why is it that we know so little about her? It's an important question because it would help us to understand what made Merton tick if we knew more about his mother's background. Although he mentions her several times in his autobiography, he tells us nothing of any great consequence. He says that her name was Elizabeth and that she died in 1875 at the age of 72, but he doesn't even reveal her maiden name. That part of the problem is easily resolved by looking up her marriage in the parish registers. This is a page from the Register of St Peter's Church in Wolverhampton, which tells us that her maiden name was Elizabeth Law. Again, note the spelling of Cotes. It's also worth mentioning that she was heavily pregnant at the time of the wedding. She gave birth to a daughter called Anne 3 days later, although sadly she only survived for a few hours. So we now know Elizabeth's maiden name, but the difficulties start to arise when we try to find out when and where she was born. The censuses are usually the best place to look for that, although they aren't always accurate, and they contain slightly different information each time. For example, on the first census in 1841, ages of adults were supposed to be rounded down to the nearest multiple of 5 years. That census also tells us only whether a person was born in their county of residence or not. In Elizabeth's case, she was living in Wolverhampton at the time, so the no here suggests that she wasn't born in Staffordshire. The age implies that she was born in 1801 or earlier, but this information is notoriously unreliable. What we do know is that Elizabeth remarried in 1844, a couple of years after the death of Merton's father. So as we can see here, she became Mrs. Henry Edwards at that point. We can also see that her father's name was Richard Law and that he was a whitesmith, which was another name for a metal worker. Now let's roll forward to the 1851 census, which shows Henry and Elizabeth living in Toxteth Park in Liverpool. Henry is shown as a draper's assistant, so they're clearly not that well off. You'll notice that Merton wasn't with them on census night, but that's a completely different story, which I won't go into here. The key point is that Elizabeth is said to be 43 years old and that she was born in Wolverhampton, which is in Staffordshire, of course. She's clearly understating her age, but we at least seem to have nailed down her birthplace, even though that contradicts what was given in 1841. But as you can see here, the 1861 census further muddies the waters by giving her birthplace as Westminster. Not only that, but she's managed to defy time by aging only 5 years in the previous decade. And unfortunately, the 1871 census fails to settle the issue. Elizabeth was then living with Merton at the Hanover Hotel in Scotland, and we're told only that she was born in England. Now, anyone who's tried to investigate their own family history will know that inconsistencies like these are extremely common, particularly with a person's age. The most accurate representation of Elizabeth's age is perhaps given on her marriage licence when she married Merton's father in 1822. This says that she was 23 at the time, which suggests that she was born in either 1798 or 1799. That's a bit earlier than Merton thought. To cap it all, when Elizabeth died in 1875, Merton sent his 14-year-old daughter Ella to register the death, which seems a particularly odd thing to do. Scottish death certificates are supposed to contain the names of the deceased's parents, and so poor Ella would have found herself being asked for the names of 2 of her great-grandparents. That would certainly have floored me at the age of 14. She told the registrar that the name of Elizabeth's father was Thomas Law, which we know is incorrect, and she didn't even hazard a guess at the name of Elizabeth's mother. And that was a great genealogical opportunity missed, as the names of her parents would have helped enormously in tracking Elizabeth down. So where does all this leave us? Could Merton's mother be the daughter of Richard and Martha Law, who was baptised at St Mary's Church in Lambeth in January 1800? It more or less fits date-wise, and St Mary's is just across the Thames from Westminster, which would fit with the birthplace given on the 1861 census. In fact, the landing stage for the ferry across the river from Westminster led straight to the front door of St Mary's Church. But this is all far from conclusive. Law is a very common surname, and there were plenty of Richard Laws around at the time in both London and Staffordshire to confuse the issue. I could bore you with the details of my fruitless attempts to discover more about Elizabeth, but I'll quickly move on before everyone falls asleep. But if anyone fancies a genealogical challenge, then be sure to let me know. So let's move on to the next great Merton mystery. Where did he go to school? Considering the enormous length of his autobiography, Merton is extremely vague about his schooling, to the point of coyness in fact. When a boy, he wrote, although the trend of my mind developed a love of music, geography, botany and a study of scientific subjects, yet art predominated and took first place. He goes on to say, before I was 10 years old I could draw the world or any detached part of it on a blackboard with a bit of chalk and mark any country or city which I was asked for. Unfortunately though, Merton doesn't tell us where or when he went to school. But there's no doubt that he was a highly educated man. He frequently wrote letters to the press, and they were always articulate and well argued, and they were often very, very long. His obituarist, the journalist William Pickford, recalled that Merton had a fervent zeal for controversy, and he could argue on the lost tribes of Israel and things of that sort with the vigour of a proselyte. So where did he acquire the education to do things like that? Given that he spent his early career as a salesman and commercial traveller, it's tempting to believe that he educated himself as he went along. But that argument only holds water to a limited degree. Commercial travellers needed to be both literate and numerate because paperwork and figures were an integral part of their job. Merton would have had a hard time dealing with his customers if he couldn't write up an invoice or calculate a discount. Merton's father, Samuel Cotes, was in a similar line of work, so it stands to reason that he knew the value of giving his children a good education. Samuel was also doing well enough financially to pay for the privilege, at least to some extent. Whether that went beyond the few pence a day required to send a child to a church school is hard to say, but there's no doubt that all of Merton's brothers and sisters could read and write. This was in stark contrast to Merton's paternal grandfather, who had signed his name with a cross when he got married back in 1790. We should bear in mind, though, that Merton was only 6 when his father died. The financial blow this caused to the family might well have knocked his schooling off track for a while, but his older siblings would probably have helped out. The family were living in Wolverhampton at the time, but his mother's remarriage meant that she and her new husband relocated to Merseyside a couple of years later. And although there's no record of Merton being in the area at the time, it's fairly safe to assume that he moved north when his mother did. But what education he received on Merseyside is a complete mystery, and the next time we can see him on official records is on the 1851 census. Although his mother was living in Liverpool at that point, Merton had gone to London, where he is listed as a visitor in the house of a wine merchant's clerk in Mile End. He was 15 at the time, but what he was doing there is yet another conundrum. In his autobiography, Merton claims to have studied medicine at Glasgow University in the early 1850s, but I've found no evidence to support that claim. He doesn't appear in the university's enrolment records, although, interestingly, a gentleman called William Watkins did enrol at the university at exactly the right time. And who was he? Well, he just happened to be one of Annie's cousins. And as Mr. Watkins later studied medicine at the university, it seems likely that Merton borrowed his university career from Annie's cousin as a way of boosting his educational credentials. It's also interesting that Merton credits his brother-in-law, James McEwen, with sponsoring him through university. While that seems unlikely based on what I've just said, Merton also says that McEwen got him a job with a mercantile house in Buenos Aires. And that trip to Argentina is, oddly enough, the only record I've managed to find of Merton being in a school. In this case, though, he was drafted in as a temporary teacher at the Scott School in Buenos Aires. He was only 20 at the time, and he only taught there for a month, but it proves beyond doubt that he had a good level of education at that point. So even though we may never know where he went to school, Merton's parents, his siblings, and indeed Merton himself, made sure that he received all the education he needed to be successful. Next, we come to one of the most baffling of the great Merton mysteries, and that is, what exactly was his connection to the Scottish Amicable Life Assurance Society? That Merton once held a senior position with the Scottish Amicable is one of the most enduring pieces of Russell-Cotes folklore. It's mentioned in his autobiography, so we ought to be able to take it at face value. He says, I was appointed by the late Mr. William Spence, the founder of the Scottish Amicable Society, to the position of Resident Secretary and Superintendent of Agencies for that society in Ireland. During my residence in Dublin, I had occasion to travel officially throughout Ireland during my connection with the society for some years. Curiously, this is the only employment mentioned by Merton right up to the time he came to Bournemouth, so it's not surprising that the Scottish Amicable has plugged a gap in many of the potted biographies written about Merton down the years. I've even heard it said that he stayed with the firm for 16 years, even though Merton himself doesn't actually say how long he worked for them. I had my doubts about the Scottish Amicable connection from the beginning, and it was one of the first aspects of Merton's life I decided to investigate. My first port of call was the firm's archivist, or to be more accurate, I contacted the man from the Prue, as the Scottish Amicable's business was taken over by the Prudential in 1997. Anyway, despite an extensive search, their archivist couldn't find anything about Merton in their records. Surely there would be some trace of him if he held such a senior position with the firm. What I did discover from the archivist is that Merton's account of how the Scottish Amicable was founded is entirely fanciful. Merton claims that it was established by William Spence, who was the man who allegedly gave him a job with the firm. According to Merton, Spence decided to set up the Scottish Amicable when the company he was working for failed to pay out on a client's life policy. That, so Merton says, was due to an undeclared history of tuberculosis within that person's family. My other research soon established that Merton had been a salesman and commercial traveller in the textiles and clothing trades for much of his early working life. But I also discovered that he had indeed been in Dublin for about 2 years from 1861. But what was he doing there? That was the question. And then, as luck would have it, I found a birth announcement in the Irish Times for Merton and Annie's daughter, Clary. Somewhat unusually, the announcement gives the name of Merton's employer, a firm called John Blair & Co. of Glasgow. It turns out that they were a successful manufacturer of hats and caps, and I've subsequently discovered evidence of Merton working as a commercial traveller for John Blair & Co. while he was in Ireland. It seems then that he was not only reluctant to mention that he was once a humble travelling salesman, but he also appears to have used a career in the insurance industry to fill the gaps in his CV. It's also worth mentioning that the earliest record I found of an association with the Scottish Amicable is in a potted biography in a local newspaper in 1906. Merton was over 70 by then. Earlier accounts of his life make no mention of it at all. But it would be a mistake to believe that Merton plucked the Scottish Amicable out of thin air as a retrospective career choice. He definitely had connections to the firm, although the two links that I'm aware of were not as an employee. Firstly, when Merton's brother-in-law James McEwen died in 1857, the only thing of value he left behind was a life policy with, you can probably guess, the Scottish Amicable. It paid out more than £1,000 to Merton's sister Clara, which is about £100,000 in today's terms. Merton was only 22 at the time, and whether he saw any of that money is a moot point. Even so, it's interesting to note that the Scottish Amicable's claims register records the fact that McEwen died of consumption. That's tuberculosis, in other words. That has strange echoes of Merton's erroneous story about the firm's foundation. But an even bigger mystery about the Scottish Amicable crops up much later in Merton's career. In 1884, when he'd been in Bournemouth for about 8 years, he hosted a grand banquet at the Royal Bath Hotel. He was about to embark on a long trip abroad, and he invited a host of friends and associates to join him in saying farewell. One of the people who apologised for non-attendance was a Mr. William Spence of Glasgow. This was the son of the man mentioned in Merton's story about the foundation of the Scottish Amicable, and just like his father, Spence Jr. held a senior position with the firm. So there is clearly some sort of connection here, but my guess is that it's to do with the hotel rather than Merton's past employment. And that brings me very neatly onto the next of the great Merton mysteries. How did he raise the money to buy and extend the Bath Hotel? The number one question asked by people when they visit the museum is, where did Merton get his money from? The extraordinary success of the Royal Bath Hotel clearly made him wealthy in later life, but that still leaves us with the question of how he raised the money to buy the hotel in the first place. This may be the biggest Merton mystery of them all, particularly when you consider that he extended and improved the hotel almost as soon as he took over at the end of 1876. Where did the money come from to do that? The first thing to bear in mind is that Merton didn't own the freehold of the hotel. That belonged to Sir George Merrick, who owned most of the land on the East Cliff. Merton was buying a lease, which meant that he didn't need anything like as much capital. I don't know what rent he was paying at the outset, but in the 1890s it was £1,200 per annum. That's about £140,000 in today's terms, which is broadly in line with what it would cost to lease a similar hotel now. Merton came to Bournemouth with 6 years' experience of running the Hanover Hotel in Glasgow. As we know, he had been a salesman and commercial traveller before that, and it wasn't uncommon for men in that line of work to move into the hotel business. Good commercial travellers could earn decent money, and they had plenty of experience of hotels from a customer perspective. Merton had taken over the Hanover Hotel in 1870, but again he was a tenant and not the freeholder. He claims to have left Glasgow for health reasons, and I'm sure that must have played its part. But an equally important catalyst was the fact that the hotel was next door to Glasgow's Queen Street Station, and his landlord was the local railway company. They needed to expand the station, which meant knocking down the Hanover Hotel to make room. That was a pretty good reason to move out. But the timing didn't work out too badly for Merton in the end, because he kept the hotel in Glasgow for almost 2 years after moving to Bournemouth. That gave him some useful extra income while he was settling in. It's also possible that he received compensation from the railway company when he was forced to move out. So it's easy to see how Merton could have gone from being the tenant of one hotel in Glasgow to renting another one on the south coast. But how on earth did he afford all the improvements that he made to the hotel in Bournemouth? He added new wings and reconfigured the top floor, as well as upgrading the plumbing and gas fittings. And he used art to market the hotel too, so the combined cost of all this must have been enormous. One theory I've heard is that he borrowed heavily, but it would have taken a courageous lender to finance such an ambitious project in its entirety. Surely then something else must have been going on. In his autobiography, Merton says that he only decided to improve the hotel a few weeks after he took over, but the evidence shows that he came to Bournemouth with that idea firmly fixed in his mind. A report in the local press from January 1877 states that we understand that in a short time the hotel will be enlarged and considerable improvements effected in order to make proper provision for the growing wants of the town. And here I think is a possible clue to what might have been going on. Bournemouth was then expanding at a prodigious rate, and anyone with a commercial interest in the town stood to profit if they played their cards right. Sir George Merrick, Merton's landlord, was one of those who stood to gain if the revamped hotel proved to be a success. He could charge higher rent for a start, but there would have been other benefits too. The Bath Hotel, or the Royal Bath as Merton renamed it, was the premier hotel in an upmarket resort. Its success helped to spread the word that Bournemouth was a lovely place to visit, if you had the money, that is. Some of those people who came to the town as visitors later chose to live in Bournemouth, and so Sir George Merrick would have benefited from the sale and rental of properties built on his land. One possibility then is that Sir George Merrick invested in the improvements of the hotel on the expectation of seeing a healthy return. Merton himself was acutely aware of the importance of the hotel as a marketing tool for Bournemouth as a resort. That helped to boost the value of Merton's other property investments in the area, which in turn kept the cash coming in for further improvements to the hotel later on. Even so, Merrick may not have been the only person to invest in the hotel when Merton took over. I suspect that other individuals or firms may have done so too, and they would have been well rewarded for their trouble. I mentioned earlier that Merton invited William Spence Jr. to a banquet at the Royal Bath in 1884. One possibility is that the Scottish Amicable had some sort of commercial relationship to the hotel. I can only guess at what that might have been, but Merton surely wouldn't have expected Spence to travel all the way down from Glasgow if all he did was sort out his insurance. If the Royal Bath's finances have yet to be understood, the hotel itself plays a significant role in the next Merton mystery, and that is, to what extent was he responsible for the infamous South Road dispute? Some of you will already know about South Road, but for those who don't, it was an extraordinary right-of-way dispute that centred on a seemingly insignificant cul-de-sac next to the Royal Bath Hotel. It can be seen here in this 1962 photograph of the area. The three houses on the opposite side of the road to the hotel were known as Rothsay, Kildare and Linwood. They're no longer there, of course, as they were demolished in the 1970s to make way for the Bath Road car park. Merton bought the leases of these three houses in 1893, and he made Rothsay his family home shortly afterwards. He changed its name to Eastcliff Hall, which will be familiar to many of you as the original name of the Russell-Cotes Art Gallery and Museum. But that's a completely different building which didn't exist at the time I'm referring to. You can clearly see from this picture that South Road separated Merton's house from the hotel. But why was that a problem? Well, to answer that, we need to consider what was going on in Bournemouth more generally at the time. The direct railway line from London had been completed in 1888, which reduced the journey time from the capital for the Royal Bath's wealthy guests. But the new line also encouraged a different type of visitor to come to Bournemouth. Merton called them cheap trippers, and you can guess from that description that he wasn't thrilled about their presence. This is what he said in a letter to the press. For them there are such places as Weymouth, Margate, Southend, Greenwich, etc., etc., and in the north Blackpool, Isle of Man, etc., etc. The tradesmen of Bournemouth do not and never did cater for visitors, I don't refer to residents, otherwise than the elite. As the number of day trippers to the town increased, entertainments sprang up on the beach to keep them amused on their grand day out. Itinerant traders set up swings, roundabouts, coconut shies, fairground booths and the like, which was great for the day trippers, but it rather lowered the tone on the beach below the Royal Bath. Worse than that, these traders liked to use South Road to park their carts, and that's when the situation really started to get out of hand. The exact chain of events is unclear, but Merton almost certainly asked Sir George Merrick to put pressure on the council to restrict access to South Road. The council was willing to cooperate to a limited extent, but they made it clear that they wanted the road to remain open. The council was particularly concerned about the impact on pedestrians and bath chair users, who often use South Road as a shortcut to the Overcliff. After various failed attempts to resolve the problem, things got really serious in December 1894. This was just a few weeks after Merton had been appointed mayor. Almost overnight, a substantial earthwork mysteriously appeared in South Road, which narrowed its width from 30 feet to 7 feet. The remaining 23 feet ended up in the garden of Eastcliff Hall. Merton soon planted shrubs and flowers on this new piece of land, and he erected a summer house with fine views out to sea. Now, I won't bore you with the details of what followed, but let's just say that the South Road dispute came to dominate Merton's mayoralty. The council sought redress from Sir George Merrick in the first instance, but their failure to reach a compromise, plus a lot of pressure from local residents, eventually forced the council into action. And so, in the early hours of the morning, on Wednesday the 7th of August 1895, 56 council workmen arrived under the cover of darkness to restore South Road to its original state. Merton and Annie were in Scotland by then, so they weren't around to see what happened. As you can imagine, the press had a field day with all this, and portrayed it as a victory for the residents in the face of an abuse of power by the mayor and the lord of the manor. But who was actually responsible for what happened in South Road? Merton had sat through several meetings while the council agonised over what to do, but their focus was always on Sir George Merrick rather than on him. Merton remained largely silent on the matter in the council chamber until legal action became a real possibility. At that point he made an impassioned plea to the assembled councillors. As owner of the property, I had no other course than to cooperate with Sir George Merrick through thick and thin. It was the sheer fact that the nuisance, had it continued, would have ruined the Royal Bath Hotel. Some people saw this as an admission of guilt, but Merton never explicitly stated that he was responsible for erecting the massive earthwork in South Road. In fact, after the road was restored, Merrick was reported to have said that it was on his head alone and that Merton had nothing to do with it. So who done it? Merton had the most to gain from restricting access to the road, but he would never have acted without Merrick's backing. But I'll leave it for you to decide whether Merton or Merrick was the real driving force behind this infamous saga. It's amazing to think that Merton was knighted less than 14 years after the humiliation of South Road. His philanthropy helped to restore his reputation in Bournemouth, and there's no doubt that the gift of the museum was the main reason for his knighthood. But the next mystery is, did politics also play a part in it? Merton was knighted by Edward VII in July 1909, and he recalled the moment with great pride in his autobiography. After His Majesty had duly dubbed me Sir Merton, I leaned forward to kiss his hand, when he took mine in his and gave it a firm grasp, and then, still holding it and giving it a still more firm and kindly grasp, to my astonishment assisted me to rise. Is it to be wondered at that this great-hearted man was universally loved and called the Prince of Peacemakers? I've not seen the official citation for Merton's knighthood, but it's safe to assume that it was largely down to the donation of the museum to the council. For me, that alone is worthy of a knighthood. But as so often happens with these things, it's possible that there may have been some political shenanigans too. And I think it's worth exploring, not to devalue Merton's knighthood in any way, but because it highlights the age-old issues of party funding and cash for honours. Now, Merton never made any secret of his political affiliations, and his autobiography makes absolutely clear that he was a committed conservative. He hero-worshipped Disraeli, and he didn't think much of Gladstone. He was even in the running to become the Conservative candidate for Oldham at the 1906 general election. Although he declined that opportunity on health grounds, you might wonder why a man living in Bournemouth was considered suitable to represent a constituency 250 miles away. Well, Merton did have a loose connection with the town. His lone collection of nearly 200 paintings had been exhibited in Oldham in 1902, so it's possible that he came to the attention of the local Conservative Association via that route. What makes it particularly interesting is that the exhibition was opened by Winston Churchill, who at the time was Oldham's Conservative Member of Parliament. Merton didn't attend the opening, so the two men didn't get the chance to share their political views on that occasion. Besides, a couple of years later, Churchill defected to the Liberal Party, where he remained until well into the 1920s. All of this becomes relevant when we look at what happened in the latter part of 1908. Remember, this is just a few months before Merton's knighthood. A year earlier, he and Annie had donated Eastcliff Hall and its contents to Bournemouth Council, and the couple had later been honoured with the freedom of the borough. By then, Merton had become a sort of wise old owl in Bournemouth, and he willingly lent his support to anything that might help to promote the town. We know, for example, that he lobbied the government in support of a pavilion, which had been the subject of public debate for donkey's years. Something along those lines may have prompted Merton to seek a private meeting with Winston Churchill in November of 1908. We know that he arranged to meet him because the relevant letters are held in the archives at Cambridge University. Churchill was president of the Board of Trade at the time, which gave him a seat in the cabinet. Now, rather than approaching Churchill directly to ask for a meeting, Merton asked Lady Cornelia Wimborne to provide him with a letter of introduction. Lady Wimborne was Churchill's aunt, and Merton had dealt with her on various matters in the past. In fact, he'd only recently bought 40 acres of land in Poole from the Wimborne estate. It made sense then for Merton to use Lady Wimborne to gain access to her nephew. Quite why Merton wanted to see Churchill isn't clear from the correspondence, but that's pretty much irrelevant in the context of what I'm talking about. Lady Wimborne duly provided Merton with the letter of introduction he'd asked for, but she also wrote privately to Churchill to give him some background information before the meeting. She mentioned, for example, the art exhibition in Oldham and the gift of the museum to Bournemouth Council. But her letter to Churchill also shows that she sensed an opportunity. Merton, she said, aspired to becoming an influential country gentleman. I do not know what his politics are, but I feel quite sure that if you are civil and kind to him, and if we all make much of him, we should gain his support. You know how destitute we Liberals are of any support of wealthy people, and I am anxious to get Mr. Russell-Cotes to declare himself on our side. Now, Merton was a highly principled man, and I doubt very much if a few kind words would have been enough for him to turn his back on the Conservative Party. Nevertheless, I can imagine that he felt obliged to give Churchill a fair hearing. And that could explain why Merton attended a Liberal Party meeting in Westbourne about 6 weeks after his interview with Churchill. That's significant because it's the only instance I can find of Merton attending a Liberal gathering at any time in his life. The main speaker at the meeting was Freddie Guest, who was not only the prospective Liberal candidate for East Dorset, but he also happened to be one of Lady Wimborne's sons. One historian describes Freddie Guest as a dim-witted cousin of Winston Churchill, which is factually correct, at least in part. And that same historian also points out that Guest was later one of the masterminds behind the sale of honours to boost the Liberal Party's funds. And although that was several years after Merton's knighthood, the sale of honours was nothing new, and it wasn't strictly illegal until a change in the law in 1925. In Merton's case, though, it seems to me that the Liberals come out of this looking far worse than he did. I can't find any record of him attending a party meeting after the one in Westbourne, and when Churchill opened a new Liberal club in Branksome in August 1909, Merton seems to have decided to give the event a miss. And that, I should emphasise, was just a couple of weeks after his knighthood. Nevertheless, this whole sequence of events gives a fascinating insight into the murky world of party funding. It's obvious from what I've just said that Lady Wimborne believed that Merton was a rich man, which prompts the question posed in my final Merton mystery. Why did he leave so little money when he died? Merton died in January 1921, and his many charitable donations suggest that he had plenty of spare cash in the bank in the last few years of his life. But how rich was he exactly? One way of approaching that question is to look at the value of his estate for probate purposes. But the answer it gives is not what you might expect. The gross value is shown as over £51,000, which equates to well over £2 million in today's terms. That would certainly make him wealthy. But look at the net value of his estate. It's only £885, which is about £40,000 in today's money. Now, I'm not an expert on probate matters, but this strikes me as very odd. As I understand it, the net value of an estate takes account of funeral expenses, debts and anything else that might reduce the inheritance tax liability. The trouble is that we don't know what these items were in Merton's case. When I've mentioned this to various people in the past, it's often been suggested to me that the gift of the museum explains the difference between the gross and net values. But the problem is that Annie had transferred the ownership of the building to the council back in 1908, and she had subsequently given away the freehold too. Merton and Annie were left with only a life tenancy, and so it couldn't have been part of either of their estates for probate purposes. But could the Royal Bath Hotel have been something to do with it? Well, no, because the business had been converted into a limited company in 1913, with Merton and Annie as the sole shareholders. In other words, the hotel's debts would not have been part of the couple's personal liabilities. There are no clues within Annie's estate either. Her assets were valued at just £407 when she died, although it's interesting to note that probate on her estate was granted only after Merton's death. So what does all this mean? Are we to assume that Merton had accumulated £50,000 worth of debt at the time of his death? One thing that we have to consider is that he and Annie had given away huge sums of money in the last few years of their lives. As well as substantial gifts to the museum, they gave away thousands of pounds to the Shaftesbury Society, Dr. Barnardo's, the Bournemouth Blind Aid Society, and various other local charities. And many other gifts no doubt went unreported. This makes me wonder if some of these donations were effectively made out of Merton's estate. But, as I say, I'm no expert, so this is just speculation. But if there are any probate lawyers or experts on historical tax regimes in the House, then I look forward to hearing from you. And the same goes for any of the other great Merton mysteries I've talked about today. Sometimes you just need one tiny breakthrough to open the way to an answer. So if anyone has any bright ideas or can suggest new avenues of research, then please do get in touch with me via my blog page. The address is at the bottom of the screen. Or you should be able to get to it by typing Sketches of a Salesman into your internet search engine. I do hope that we never discover everything about Merton though. I'll have nothing left to talk about if we know all the answers. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.